He thought $5 would buy him a cook and nothing more. But when the chained Yakama woman whispered her last name at Fort Cascade, Matthias Kane's blood turned to ice, because that name belonged to a family he'd destroyed 15 years ago. And the woman he'd just purchased for the price of a bottle of whiskey was about to make him pay for every sin he'd buried in the Oregon wilderness. The morning mist clung to the Columbia River like smoke from a dying campfire when Matthias Kane rode his tired mare into Fort Cascade with nothing but $37 in his pocket and a hunger that had been gnawing at his gut for 3 days straight. The fort squatted on the riverbank like a wooden beast, its palisade walls dark with moisture and age, and the sound of men's voices carried across the water along with the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting fish, and something else that made Matthias's stomach clench with a familiar dread. The October air bit sharp against his weathered face, carrying the promise of an early winter that would drive lesser men south to warmer territories. But Matthias had learned long ago that geography couldn't outrun the ghosts that followed a man wherever he went.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
He hadn't planned to stop at the fort at all. Had been heading north, to the lumber camps in the Cascade foothills where a man could disappear into the endless green of Douglas fir and western red cedar, lose himself in the rhythm of saw and axe until the memories stopped clawing at his mind. Like wolves in winter, but his horse was lame, his supplies were gone, and the October cold was already settling into his bones with the promise of a harsh winter ahead. A man had to eat, and Fort Cascade was the last outpost before the wilderness. Swallowed everything in its green maw, the mare beneath him wheezed with each step, her left foreleg favoring a stone bruise that had developed 3 days back when they'd crossed the rocky ford near government camp, and Matthias knew she needed rest and grain before they could continue their journey into the high country, where the big timber waited. The gate stood open, guarded by 2 soldiers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the Oregon Territory. Their blue uniforms faded and stained with the accumulated grime of frontier duty, and as Matthias rode through the entrance, he could see the usual collection of traders, trappers, and drifters that gathered at frontier posts like vultures around carrion. There was something different about this morning, though. Something in the way men clustered together in tight groups, their voices low and urgent, their eyes bright with the kind of excitement that meant trouble for someone. The fort's interior was a maze of wooden buildings arranged around a central courtyard, where soldiers drilled and merchants hawked their wares to anyone with coin to spend, and the whole place hummed with an energy that reminded Matthias of a mining camp on payday, when men had money burning holes in their pockets and no good sense to guide their spending. Matthias dismounted near the trading post, a squat log building that served as both general store and gathering place for anyone with business at the fort. And as he tied his mare to the hitching rail, he caught fragments of conversation that made his jaw tighten with old anger. They were talking about an auction, something about merchandise that had arrived on yesterday's supply wagon. And the way they said it made Matthias think of cattle or horses rather than anything human. But he'd heard that tone before, in other places, other times, and he knew what kind of merchandise could make men's voices drop to whispers while their eyes burned with anticipation. The wooden rail was worn smooth by countless hands and rope, and as Matthias secured his horse, he noticed how the mare's ribs showed through her winter coat, a reminder that they'd both been living lean for weeks now, surviving on whatever work he could find and whatever game he could shoot. The trading post was packed with more men than Matthias had seen in one place since leaving the lumber camp near Salem 3 weeks ago, and the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the sharp smell of whiskey that someone had been passing around since before dawn. Captain Morris Standish, the fort's commanding officer and a man who'd grown fat on army rations and questionable deals with civilian traders, stood behind the rough-hewn counter with the smile of a man about to make money. His uniform was clean, enough to suggest he took his appearance seriously. But the stains on his fingers told a different story about his character, and the way he kept checking a gold pocket watch suggested that whatever was about to happen had been planned down to the minute. Around him, the crowd pressed close. Men who smelled of sweat and horses, and the kind of desperation that came from spending too many months in the wilderness with only each other for company. "Gentlemen," Standish called out as Matthias pushed through the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd never seen real combat, but had spent years perfecting the art of looking important. "We have some unusual merchandise today, acquired through proper military channels and available for immediate sale to qualified buyers." The way he said qualified buyers made it clear that money was the only qualification that mattered, and Matthias felt his stomach turn as he realized what was about to happen. He'd seen auctions like this before. Back in his younger days when he wore a different uniform and followed orders without questioning where they came from or who they hurt. The memories of those times sat heavy in his chest like stones, weighing him down with the accumulated guilt of choices he couldn't undo and actions he couldn't take back. The door at the back of the trading post opened with a creak that seemed to echo through the sudden silence, and two soldiers dragged out a figure that made every man in the room go quiet with something between hunger and shame. She was Yakama. That much was clear from the proud line of her cheekbones and the way she held her head, despite the iron shackles around her wrists and ankles. Her long black hair hung loose around her shoulders, unwashed but still catching the light from the oil lamps like polished obsidian, and there were braids woven through it with small beads that caught the light and spoke of a life that had been rich with tradition and meaning. Before soldiers had torn it all away, her dress was torn and stained. Probably once a beautiful example of traditional Yakama beadwork, but now reduced to rags that barely covered her from the cold and the stares of 30 men who saw her as property rather than a person. She couldn't have been more than 25. With the kind of beauty that spoke of clean mountain air and open skies, rather than the cramped confines of army camps and trading posts. But there was steel in her dark eyes as she surveyed the crowd, no fear or pleading. Just a cold assessment of the men who thought they could buy and sell her like a sack of flour. When her gaze swept over Matthias, he felt something twist in his chest, a recognition that had nothing to do with ever seeing her before, and everything to do with understanding what it meant to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control. Her feet were bare despite the October cold, and he could see cuts and bruises on her ankles where the shackles had chafed during however long she'd been chained. But she stood straight and proud, as if she were receiving guests in her own lodge, rather than being displayed like livestock at a frontier auction. "This here's a genuine Yakama woman," Standish announced with the enthusiasm of a carnival barker, gesturing toward her as if she were a prize bull at a county fair. "Captured during a raid on their illegal fishing camp last week. Unclaimed property, according to territorial law, and available for purchase to any man with the coin and the need for domestic help." The way he emphasized domestic help drew chuckles from some of the men, the kind of laughter that made Matthias's hands ball into fists. He'd heard that laughter before, had maybe even joined in once or twice in his younger days, and the memory of it now made him sick with self-loathing. The legal justification was typical army thinking, taking something complex and reducing it to paperwork that made theft look like legitimate commerce, and Matthias wondered how many other lives had been destroyed by men who hid behind regulations and territorial law. The bidding started at $2. Called out by a grizzled trapper who smelled like he'd been wearing the same buckskin since the Lewis and Clark expedition. His voice thick with whiskey and the kind of confidence that came from having money in his pocket for the first time in months. And immediately other voices joined in. Men competing not just for the woman, but for the chance to prove their dominance over something helpless and beautiful. $3 from a soldier who couldn't have been older than 19. His voice cracking with nervousness and excitement. $4 from a merchant who already owned 2 wives back in Portland, and spoke about the woman like she was another bolt of cloth for his store.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The bidding moved fast, driven by the same ugly energy that fueled cockfights and bear baiting. And Matthias found himself studying the faces around him, seeing the hunger and cruelty that civilization tried to hide, but that always came out when men thought no one was watching. Matthias stood near the back of the crowd, his jaw clenched so tight it ached, telling himself this wasn't his business, that he couldn't save every person the world chewed up and spat out, that he had his own sins to worry about without taking on someone else's troubles. But the woman's eyes found his again across the crowded room. And for just a moment, he saw something flicker there, not hope exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if she understood that he was different from the others, that he carried his own weight of shame and regret. His hand drifted unconsciously to the leather pouch where he kept his money, feeling the weight of the silver coins that represented weeks of backbreaking work in the logging camps, cutting timber that would become houses and fences for settlers who pushed ever deeper into lands that had belonged to other people for generations uncounted. $4 going once, Standish called out, his voice cutting through the tension. Like a blade, his eyes already calculating how much profit this would bring him and what other opportunities might arise from men who had money to spend on human cargo. Going twice. And in that moment Matthias saw himself 15 years ago, standing in another place, making another choice that had destroyed everything he'd ever cared about. He could walk away now, take his $37 north to the lumber camps, disappear into the forests where the only sounds were the whisper of wind through ancient trees and the honest ring of steel against wood. Or he could do something. Make a gesture that might not matter to anyone else but would matter to him. Might be the first step toward balancing scales that had been weighted with blood and guilt for too long. $5, he said, his voice cutting through the silence, like an axe through dry wood. And every head in the room turned toward him with expressions ranging from surprise to anger. The woman's eyes widened slightly, the first real emotion he'd seen her display. And Standish's smile grew wider as he realized he'd found a buyer willing to pay more than these frontier dregs could afford. Someone in the crowd cursed, probably the merchant who'd been confident his $4 bid would carry the day. And Matthias could feel the weight of hostile stares from men who'd been outbid by a stranger who looked like he didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. $5 from the gentleman in the back, Standish announced, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that made Matthias want to put his fist through the man's teeth. Any other bids, but the room had gone quiet, the other men backing away from something they couldn't afford, their faces showing a mixture of disappointment and resentment that spoke of opportunities lost and pride wounded. After a moment that stretched like eternity, Standish brought his hand down on the counter with a sound like a gunshot. Sold to the Lumberjack for $5. Payable immediately in gold or silver coin. The finality of it hit Matthias like a physical blow, the realization that he'd just bought another human being, that he was now complicit in the system he'd spent years trying to forget. Matthias pushed through the crowd, ignoring the muttered curses and dark looks from men who'd been outbid, their hostility palpable as he made his way to the counter where Standish waited with barely concealed glee, and placed $5 silver on the scarred wood with a sound like judgment. The coins were warm from his body heat, earned through honest sweat in the lumber camps where men died regularly from falling trees and broken cables. And now he was spending them on something that should never have been for sale. Standish swept the coins into his pocket with practiced efficiency and handed Matthias a piece of paper that was supposed to serve as a bill of sale. As if a human being could be owned and transferred like livestock. The whole transaction took less than a minute, but Matthias felt like he'd aged years. In that time, felt the weight of another decision that he'd have to carry for the rest of his life. The soldiers unlocked the shackles from the woman's ankles but left her wrists bound, the iron cuffs clicking open with sounds that seemed unnaturally loud. In the sudden quiet of the trading post, and as they pushed her toward Matthias, she stumbled slightly, her legs weak from however long she'd been chained. He reached out instinctively to steady her, and when their eyes met, he saw something there that made his chest tight with emotions he'd thought he'd buried years ago. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. It was the way she held herself despite everything that had been done to her, the pride that couldn't be broken even by iron chains, and the stares of men who saw her as less than human. Her skin was bronze from sun and wind, marked with small scars that spoke of a life lived outdoors. And when she looked at him, he felt like she could see straight through to his soul. "She's your problem now," one of the soldiers said with a laugh that held no humor. A young man whose uniform was too clean and whose eyes held the kind of casual cruelty that came from too much power and too little conscience. "Don't expect her to cook or clean without a fight. These Yakama women are stubborn as mules when they want to be." The casual racism in his voice made Matthias want to reach for the Colt .45 on his hip, but he forced himself to stay calm. To think about getting the woman away from this place before someone decided $5 wasn't enough and tried to take her back. The soldier's words carried the weight of experience, suggesting that this wasn't the first time human beings had been sold at Fort Cascade, and Matthias wondered how many other lives had been destroyed in this same room. Matthias led her outside into the crisp October air, and as they walked toward his horse, he could feel the eyes of every man at the fort following them. Some with envy, others with the kind of speculation that meant trouble. The courtyard was busier now, with soldiers going about their morning duties and traders setting up their wares for another day of business. But conversations stopped as they passed, and Matthias could hear whispered comments about his purchase that made his jaw clench with suppressed anger. The woman walked beside him without speaking, her bare feet silent on the packed earth of the fort's courtyard. And when they reached his mare, she looked up at the animal with something that might have been recognition, as if horses were familiar friends rather than tools for transportation. "What's your name?" he asked quietly, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. And for a moment she just stared at him as if trying to decide whether he was different from the others, or just better at hiding his intentions. The morning light caught the copper tones in her dark hair, and he could see that despite the dirt and exhaustion, she was younger than he'd first thought, probably closer to 20 than 25, which made what had been done to her seem even more monstrous. Then she lifted her chin slightly, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and strong despite everything she'd been through, carrying the musical quality that seemed to be common among her people. "I am called Kiona," she said. And then after a pause that seemed to stretch forever, her dark eyes never leaving his face, "Kiona Redwing." And the world seemed to tilt sideways as the name hit Matthias like a physical blow. Because Redwing was a name he knew. A name that belonged to a family he'd helped destroy 15 years ago when he was young and stupid and thought following orders was the same thing as doing right. The name echoed in his mind like a gunshot, bringing with it a flood of memories he'd spent years trying to drown in whiskey and hard work. The memories came flooding back with the force of a spring avalanche. Images he'd spent years trying to bury beneath whiskey and hard work and the endless green silence of the Oregon forests. A Yakama village on the banks of the Yakama River. Smoke rising from traditional lodges in the gray dawn light. The sound of children crying and women screaming as soldiers rode through with torches and rifles. And at the center of it all, Chief Thomas Redwing. A man who'd tried to negotiate peace and died for his efforts with a bullet through the heart. A bullet fired by a young cavalry sergeant named Matthias Kane, who'd been told that Indians were the enemy and had believed it without question. Matthias staggered backward as if he'd been shot, his face draining of color as he stared at the woman who carried the name of the man he'd helped murder. And Kiona's eyes narrowed as she saw his reaction, understanding immediately that this wasn't just recognition, but something deeper and more terrible, something that connected them in ways that went far beyond the $5 he'd just paid. For her freedom, the October wind picked up, stirring the dust in the courtyard and carrying with it the scent of pine from the distant mountains. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, caught in the grip of a past that refused to stay buried. "You know that name," she said. And it wasn't a question but a statement of fact, her voice carrying the weight of 15 years of loss and anger. The accumulated grief of a people who'd been scattered and broken by men who claimed to represent civilization and progress. "You know what happened to my people," and Matthias could only nod, his throat too tight for words, as he realized that whatever god or demon controlled the fates of men had brought him face to face with the daughter of the man whose blood was on his hands. The fort around them seemed to fade away, the sounds of men and horses and the river becoming distant and unreal as the past and present collided with the force of a runaway locomotive. Matthias had thought he could outrun his sins, disappear into the wilderness and emerge clean on the other side. But standing here in the October cold with Thomas, Redwing's daughter, looking at him with eyes that held the accumulated pain of her entire people, he understood that some debts could never be escaped, only paid. And the reckoning he'd been running from for 15 years had finally caught up with him in the most unexpected way possible. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, ready to snap, and Matthias felt the weight of 15 years pressing down on his shoulders as Kiona, Redwing, studied his face with the intensity of a hawk watching prey. She could see the recognition there, the guilt written in every line around his eyes, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the cold authority of someone who had learned to read men's souls in their darkest moments. Thomas Redwing was "My father," she said, each word falling like stones into still water. "And you were there the morning they killed him." Matthias tried to speak, tried to find words that could somehow bridge the chasm between what he had been and what he was now. But his throat felt like it was filled with sand, and all he could do was nod as the memories crashed over him like a flood breaking through a dam. He remembered the weight of the rifle in his hands, the way the morning mist had clung to the Yakama River, the sound of Chief Redwing's voice as he tried one last time to negotiate for his people's safety, and then the order that had changed everything, the command that had turned him from a soldier into a murderer. The man standing before him now bore the same proud bearing as her father, the same unflinching gaze that had looked at Matthias across a council fire and seen not an enemy, but a young man who might still choose a different path. "He tried to make peace," Kiona continued, her voice steady despite the pain that flickered in her dark eyes. "Came to your camp under a white flag, brought gifts and promises, offered to move our people to the reservation lands without fighting." She took a step closer, and Matthias could smell the wood smoke in her hair, could see the way her hands trembled slightly despite her outward calm. "But your colonel wanted war, wanted the glory of victory over the savage Indians to advance his career. And my father was just an obstacle to be removed." The truth of it hit Matthias like a physical blow, because he remembered Colonel Harrison Blackwood, a career officer who saw every conflict as an opportunity for promotion and every dead Indian as proof of his military genius. Blackwood had been the one to give the order, had claimed that Redwing's peace overture was a trick designed to lower their guard before a massive attack. And Matthias, barely 20 years old and desperate to prove himself to his superior officers, had believed every word. He remembered the way Blackwood had smiled when he gave the order to fire, the satisfaction in his voice when he declared that peace negotiations were over, and the only solution was total war against the Yakama people. "I was young," Matthias said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, and immediately hated himself for the weakness of the excuse, for trying to justify the unjustifiable with appeals to his age and inexperience. "I believed what they told me, thought I was serving my country, protecting settlers from savage attacks." The words tasted like ash in his mouth, and he could see the way Kiona's jaw tightened at his use of the word savage, could feel the weight of her contempt settling over him like a shroud. "Young," Kiona repeated, and there was a terrible mockery in her voice, a bitterness born of 15 years of loss and suffering. I was young too when I watched my father die, when I saw soldiers burn our village and scatter my people like leaves in the wind." She gestured toward the fort around them, toward the soldiers going about their daily routines as if the world wasn't built on the bones of murdered innocents. "I was 12 years old when your bullets made me an orphan, when your war turned me into a refugee in my own land." The image of her as a child, watching her father fall and her world burn, cut through Matthias like a knife, and he felt something break inside his chest. Some carefully constructed wall that had kept his guilt and shame locked away for 15 years. He had spent so long telling himself that he had been following orders, that individual soldiers couldn't be held responsible for the policies of their commanders. But standing here with Thomas Redwing's daughter, he understood that those were just lies he had told himself to make sleep possible. The truth was simpler and more terrible. He had killed a good man who was trying to save his people, and no amount of time or distance could wash that blood from his hands. "After the massacre," Kiona continued, her voice taking on the rhythm of a story told many times, each word polished smooth by repetition and grief, "the survivors scattered to the four winds, some to the reservations where they starved on government rations, others deeper into the mountains where they could live free, but always hungry, always hunted." She looked past him toward the river, toward the distant peaks of the Cascade Mountains where her people had once lived in harmony with the land. "I went with my mother's sister to the fishing camps on the Columbia, learned to live on salmon and roots and whatever we could trade with the river people." Matthias wanted to ask about her mother, wanted to know what had happened to the rest of her family. But the words died in his throat as he saw the pain that flickered across her features. Some stories were too terrible to tell to the man who had helped write them in blood and fire, and he understood that whatever suffering had followed the massacre, whatever losses had shaped her from a chief's daughter into a woman sold at auction, he bore responsibility for all of it. The weight of that knowledge settled into his bones like winter cold, and he wondered if this was what justice looked like, this moment when the past finally caught up with the present and demanded payment. "The soldiers found us 3 weeks ago," Kiona said, her voice growing harder as she returned to more recent pain. "Claimed we were fishing illegally on government land. Said our permits were forged, even though we had letters from the territorial governor himself." She looked back at him with eyes that held the accumulated rage of her entire people. "They killed the men who tried to resist, took the women and children as evidence of criminal activity, sold us to whoever had coin to pay." The casual brutality of it, the way the government had turned her people's basic need for food into a crime punishable by death or slavery, made Matthias sick with a rage that had nowhere to go. He thought of Captain Standish counting his silver coins, of the soldiers laughing as they chained human beings like animals, of the system that turned survival into a capital offense while calling it law and order. This was what his war had accomplished, what his bullet through Thomas Redwing's heart had made possible. A world where that man's daughter could be bought and sold like livestock, while her buyers congratulated themselves on their righteousness. "I should kill you," Kiona said quietly. And there was no heat in her voice, just a calm statement of fact that made the words more terrifying than any threat. "My father taught me that violence should always be the last choice. But 15 years of watching my people suffer while their killers go unpunished has taught me different lessons." She looked at his hands, at the calluses that spoke of hard work and honest labor, and then back at his face. "You carry guilt. Like a sickness. I can see it eating at you, but guilt changes nothing, brings no one back from the dead." Matthias felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized she was right, that all his years of self-recrimination and attempts at redemption had been nothing more than self-indulgence, a way of making himself feel better about crimes that demanded real justice rather than internal anguish. He had told himself that leaving the army and disappearing into the wilderness was penance, that living alone with his memories was punishment. Enough, but standing here with the daughter of his victim, he understood that true justice would require more than guilt and isolation. "What do you want from me?" he asked, and his voice sounded strange in his own ears, hollow and defeated, like a man who had finally accepted that his reckoning had come. Kiona studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes unreadable, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of 15 years of planning and pain. "I want you to help me destroy the men who did this," she said. And for the first time since he had bought her, Matthias heard something other than rage in her voice. Something that might have been hope, not just the soldiers who raided our camp, but the men who gave the orders, who built this system of murder and theft and called it civilization. She gestured toward the fort, toward the comfortable buildings where officers lived on stolen land while her people starved. Colonel Blackwood is still alive, still giving orders that turn children into orphans and free people into slaves. The name hit Matthias like a physical blow, bringing with it a flood of memories he had tried for 15 years to forget. Blackwood had been promoted after the Yakama campaign, had parlayed his victory over the Red Wing Band into a general's commission and a comfortable post in the territorial capital. The last Matthias had heard, he was living in a mansion in Salem, surrounded by comfort, bought with the blood of innocence, drawing a fat pension from the government he had served with such ruthless efficiency. The thought of that man sleeping peacefully while Kiona's people lived as hunted refugees made Matthias's hands clench into fists. "He's untouchable," Matthias said, though even as he spoke the words he could hear the defeat in his own voice. Too well connected, too protected by the system he helped build. But Kiona shook her head, and for the first time he saw something that might have been a smile touch the corners of her mouth, though it held no warmth, only the promise of vengeance. "Long deferred, no man is untouchable," she said, "and I've spent 15 years learning everything there is to know about Harrison Blackwood, his habits, his weaknesses, his fears." She reached into the torn fabric of her dress and pulled out something that made Matthias's eyes widen with surprise. A folded piece of paper, worn soft with handling. "I took this from his personal effects after the massacre, when the soldiers were too busy burning our village to guard their camp properly." Matthias unfolded the paper with trembling fingers, and what he saw there made his blood run cold. It was a letter, written in Blackwood's own hand, addressed to his superiors in Washington and dated 3 days before the attack on Red Wing's village. In it, the colonel outlined his plan to provoke a war with the Yakama people, to reject any peace overtures and use any resistance as justification for total warfare. The letter made it clear that the massacre had been planned from the beginning, that Red Wing's attempt at negotiation had been not just rejected, but used as the pretext for genocide. "This proves it was murder," Matthias said, his voice thick with emotion as he read the damning words. "Proves the whole thing was planned, that your father never had a chance." The implications of the letter were staggering, because if it became public, it wouldn't just destroy Blackwood but expose the entire territorial government as complicit in war crimes. It was the kind of evidence that could bring down administrations and send powerful men to prison if it could be brought to the right people in the right way. "I've been carrying it for 15 years, Kiona said, waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity. She looked at him with eyes that held a terrible intensity. "And now fate has brought me the one man who can help me use it, the man whose testimony could corroborate every word." The irony of it wasn't lost on either of them, the soldier who had helped commit the crime becoming the key to exposing it. The killer transformed into the instrument of justice. "They'll never believe me," Matthias said, though he could feel something stirring in his chest, something that might have been hope. "I'm nobody now. Just another broken-down logger with a drinking problem and a past I can't escape." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't entirely true, because he had been there, had seen everything. And his testimony combined with Blackwood's own letter would be impossible to dismiss or discredit. "You're wrong," Kiona said, and her voice carried a certainty that made him want to believe her. "You're Sergeant Matthias Kane of the 3rd Cavalry, and your name is in every official report of the Yakama campaign." She pulled out another paper, this one obviously torn from a military document, including this recommendation for promotion that Blackwood wrote after the massacre, praising your courage and dedication in the face of savage resistance. Reading his own name in Blackwood's flowing script, seeing himself described as a hero for murdering a man who had come in peace, made Matthias feel sick with self-loathing. But it also made him understand what Kiona was offering him, not just revenge, but redemption, the chance to finally balance the scales and make his suffering serve some purpose beyond self-pity. He looked at her standing there in the October morning light, this woman who had every reason to hate him but was offering him partnership instead of vengeance, and felt something shift inside his chest. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked, and his voice carried a strength it hadn't held in years. Kiona's smile grew wider, and this time there was warmth in it, the kind of fierce joy that came from seeing a long-cherished plan finally beginning to take shape. "We're going to Salem," she said, "and we're going to present this evidence to the Territorial Attorney General, along with your sworn testimony about what really happened 15 years ago." She folded the papers carefully and tucked them back into her dress. "And then we're going to watch Harrison Blackwood hang for his crimes." The boldness of it took Matthias's breath away, because Salem was hundreds of miles south through some of the most dangerous country in the Oregon Territory, and they would be traveling with evidence that powerful men would kill to suppress. But looking at Kiona, seeing the determination in her eyes and the steel in her spine, he understood that she had been planning this journey for 15 years, had been preparing for this moment since she was 12 years old and watching her world burn. "It won't be easy," he said, though he could already feel himself being pulled into her orbit, drawn by the promise of finally doing something right. After so many years of running from his past, Blackwood has friends everywhere, and if word gets out about what we're carrying, we'll have every corrupt sheriff and army patrol between here and Salem hunting us down. "Let them come," Kiona said, and there was something magnificent in her defiance, something that reminded Matthias powerfully of her father. "I've been hunted for 15 years, and I'm still here, still fighting." She looked toward the gate of the fort, toward the road that led south to Salem and justice. "Besides, I won't be traveling alone this time. I'll have a guide who knows the country and a protector who owes me a debt that can never be fully repaid." The weight of that debt settled over Matthias like a yoke, but for the first time in 15 years, it didn't feel like a burden, but like a purpose, a reason to keep breathing and fighting and hoping for something better. He thought of all the years he had wasted in self-pity and alcohol, all the nights he had lain awake, remembering the sound of Thomas Redwing's voice, and the way the light had gone out of his eyes, and understood that this woman was offering him something he had never dared hope for, the chance to transform his greatest sin into his greatest service. "When do we leave?" he asked, and Kiona's smile became radiant, transforming her face from something hard and bitter into something beautiful and fierce. She reached out and touched his arm, and her hand was warm against the October cold. "Now," she said, before Standish starts wondering why his newest purchase is having long conversations instead of loading supplies. She glanced toward the trading post, where they could see the captain through the window counting coins and making entries in a ledger. And before someone decides that $5 wasn't enough and tries to make a better offer, Matthias nodded and began untying his mare from the hitching post, his movements quick and efficient as 15 years of frontier living took over. But as he worked, he felt something he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember. The sense that he was finally moving toward something instead of running away from it. The road to Salem would be long and dangerous, but it would also be a path toward redemption, toward justice, toward the possibility that Thomas Redwing's death might finally serve some purpose beyond his daughter's grief. As they prepared to leave Fort Cascade behind, Matthias looked at Kiona one more time, seeing not just the victim he had helped create, but the woman she had become, strong, determined, unbroken, despite everything that had been done to her. She was her father's daughter in the best possible way, carrying his dream of justice forward into a world that had tried its best to destroy both the dream and the dreamer. And Matthias felt something like humility as he realized that she was giving him the privilege of serving that dream. The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning off the mist and revealing the harsh beauty of the Oregon landscape. And as they rode through the gates of Fort Cascade and onto the road that led south toward Salem and whatever justice waited there, Matthias Kane felt like he was finally becoming the man Thomas Redwing had seen in him 15 years ago. The man who might choose to do right even when it cost him everything. The first shot came from the ridge above Mill Creek Canyon, close enough that Matthias felt the heat of the bullet as it whispered past his ear and buried itself in the trunk of a massive Douglas fir with a sound like thunder. And as he threw himself from the saddle, dragging Kiona down with him behind the questionable cover of a fallen log, he understood that their journey to Salem had become a race for their lives before they'd even covered 50 miles from Fort Cascade. The Mare screamed and bolted, taking their supplies and his rifle with her, leaving them pinned down in a canyon where the autumn shadows offered concealment but no escape. "How many?" Kiona whispered, her voice steady despite the fact that they were trapped like rabbits in a snare. And Matthias marveled at her composure, even as he tried to count muzzle flashes among the rocks above them. She had produced a knife from somewhere in her tattered dress, a wicked-looking blade that caught the filtered sunlight, and the way she held it suggested she knew exactly how to use it. Her dark eyes scanned the canyon walls with the intensity of a predator. And Matthias realized that 15 years of survival had taught her skills that most men never learned. "At least 4, he said, trying to make himself smaller behind the log as another bullet splintered bark inches from his head, maybe more. Hard to tell with the echoes. The shots were coming from multiple positions, suggesting either a large group or men who knew how to move quickly between firing points. And the accuracy indicated military training, not the wild shooting of bounty hunters or claim jumpers. These were professionals. And that meant word of their departure from Fort Cascade had traveled faster than their horses. The truth of their situation hit him like a physical blow as he remembered Captain Standish's satisfied smile and the way the man had checked his pocket watch during the auction, as if timing had been important for reasons beyond simple commerce. The whole thing had been a trap from the beginning. A carefully orchestrated plan to get the evidence Kiona carried into the open where it could be taken or destroyed. And Matthias cursed himself for not seeing it sooner, for allowing his guilt and desperation for redemption to blind him to the obvious signs of deception. "Standish sold us out," he said, the words bitter as gall in his mouth. And Kiona's laugh held no humor, only the harsh sound of someone who had learned to expect betrayal from every source. She shifted position behind the log, her movements fluid and silent, and Matthias caught a glimpse of scars on her arms that spoke of fights survived and lessons learned the hard way. "Of course he did," she said, checking the edge of her knife with her thumb. "Men like Standish don't survive on the frontier by being honorable. They survive by knowing which way the wind blows and selling information to whoever pays the most." A bullet struck the log between them, sending splinters flying, and she didn't even flinch. The question is whether Blackwood sent these men, or whether they're working for someone else entirely. The distinction mattered more than Matthias wanted to admit, because if Blackwood was behind the ambush, it meant the general knew about the evidence and was taking steps to suppress it. But if these were hired guns working for local interests, it might mean their secret was still safe, and they were being hunted for different reasons entirely. Either way, they were pinned down in a canyon with no supplies, no horses, and no clear way out, while an unknown number of armed men held the high ground and all the advantages. "We need to move," Matthias said, scanning the canyon walls for any route that might offer escape. But the terrain was brutal, all steep slopes and loose rock. That would make climbing under fire a death sentence. "Staying here means dying here. They'll just wait us out and pick us off when we try to run." The sun was climbing higher, and soon the shadows that provided their only concealment would shift and leave them exposed. While their attackers had water and supplies and all the time in the world, Kiona was studying the creek that ran along the canyon floor, her eyes following its path as it wound between boulders and disappeared around a bend 50 yards downstream. And when she looked back at him, her expression held the grim calculation of someone weighing desperate options against certain death. "The water," she said. "It's our only chance. Follow the creek and hope it leads somewhere they can't follow." The idea was insane, because the creek was shallow and offered no cover, and they would be exposed for the entire 50 yards it took to reach the bend. But as bullets continued to rain down around them, Matthias realized that insane was their only option. The alternative was waiting for their ammunition to run out or their patience to fail. And either way, the result would be the same: death in a nameless canyon while the truth died with them. "On my signal," he said, pulling the Colt .45 from his holster and checking the cylinder. "I'll give you covering fire, but I can't hold them for long." Kiona nodded and gathered herself like a cat preparing to spring. And Matthias was struck again by her resemblance to her father. The same courage in the face of impossible odds. The same refusal to surrender even when death seemed certain. He rose from behind the log and emptied his pistol at the ridge, firing as fast as he could pull the trigger and trying to make each shot count. And in the brief moment when their attackers ducked for cover, Kiona was already moving, running low and fast toward the creek with a grace that spoke of years spent. Dodging bullets and avoiding capture, Matthias followed, his boots slipping on the loose gravel as he tried to match her speed while reloading on the run. They reached the creek just as the return fire started, bullets whining off rocks and sending up geysers of water as they splashed through the shallow stream. And Matthias felt something hot graze his shoulder as they rounded the bend and momentarily escaped the line of fire. The creek continued downstream through a narrow channel carved between towering canyon walls. And they followed it without hesitation, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant dying. "There," Kiona said, pointing to a place where the canyon wall had collapsed, creating a slope of loose rock and debris that might be climbable. "If we can reach the rim, we can lose them in the forest." It was still a gamble, because the climb would be treacherous and they would be exposed for several minutes. But it was better than following the creek into whatever trap waited downstream. They began climbing, their hands bleeding on the sharp rock as they fought for purchase on the unstable slope. And behind them they could hear shouts as their pursuers realized what was happening and began moving to cut them off. Matthias's shoulder burned where the bullet had grazed him, and his lungs felt like they were on fire. But Kiona moved above him with the sure-footed grace of someone who had grown up in mountain country, and her determination pulled him upward when his own strength began to fail. They were halfway to the rim when the first of their pursuers reached the base of the slope and opened fire. And Matthias heard Kiona cry out as a bullet struck her leg, sending her tumbling backward toward him. He caught her and pulled her against the rock face, feeling her blood warm against his hands as he tried to assess the wound. "How bad?" he asked, but she was already pushing him away, her face pale but determined. "I can climb," she said through gritted teeth. "Just keep moving." But Matthias could see that the wound was serious. A through-and-through shot in her thigh that was bleeding heavily and would make climbing almost impossible. The sounds of pursuit were getting closer, and he realized they had only minutes before their hunters reached them. That was when he made the decision that would define the rest of his life. The choice that transformed him from a man running from his past into someone finally worthy of the trust Kiona had placed in him. "Give me the papers," he said, and when she started to protest, he cut her off with a look that brooked no argument. "I'm not leaving you, but I can draw them off. Give you time to rest and bind the wound. You'll die," she said. But she was already reaching into her dress for the precious documents that represented 15 years of planning and hope. "They'll kill you and take the evidence, and everything we've worked for will be lost." But Matthias shook his head. feeling a calmness settle over him that he hadn't experienced since before the massacre. The peace that came from finally knowing what he had to do. "No," he said, taking the papers and tucking them inside his shirt. "I'll lead them away from here, make them think I have what they want, and while they're chasing me, you disappear into the forest." He looked at her bleeding leg, at the pain she was trying so hard to hide. "Bind that wound and find somewhere safe to wait. I'll come back for you when it's over." Kiona stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her calculating the odds, weighing his chances against the alternatives. And when she finally nodded, it was with the grim acceptance of someone who understood that sometimes survival required terrible choices. "The old mining camp," she said, 3 miles north of here. Follow the ridgeline and look for the tailings pile. I'll wait there for 3 days. I'll be there," he promised, though they both knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. And then he was moving, scrambling up the slope with renewed energy while shouting loud enough for their pursuers to hear, making sure they knew which way he was going. Behind him, Kiona melted into the shadows between the rocks, becoming invisible in the way her people had learned to do when survival depended on not being seen. Matthias reached the rim of the canyon just as the first of his pursuers gained the slope, and he turned to look back once, seeing muzzle flashes among the rocks but no sign of Kiona, which meant his gamble had worked and she was safely hidden. Then he was running through the forest, crashing through underbrush and making as much noise as possible, ensuring that anyone following him would have no trouble tracking his passage. The pursuit began in earnest then, voices shouting behind him as his hunters realized their quarry was escaping, and Matthias ran with the desperate energy of a man who knew that stopping meant death not just for himself, but for the woman he had left bleeding in the canyon. The forest was thick with Douglas fir and western hemlock, their massive trunks providing momentary cover as he zigzagged between them. But his pursuers were gaining ground, and he could hear them spreading out to surround him. He had been running for perhaps 20 minutes when he saw the cabin, a ramshackle structure that had probably belonged to a trapper or prospector before being abandoned to the wilderness. And without hesitation, he dove through the door, his mind already working on ways to turn the building into a fortress. The interior was sparse but functional, with thick log walls that would stop bullets and windows that commanded good fields of fire. And as he checked his ammunition, Matthias realized that this was where he would make his stand. The first of his pursuers appeared at the edge of the clearing 5 minutes later, moving with the careful precision of men who knew they had their quarry cornered. And Matthias got his first good look at the men who had been hunting them. They wore the rough clothes of frontiersmen, but their weapons were military issue and their movements spoke of professional training. These weren't bounty hunters or claim jumpers. They were soldiers operating without uniforms, which meant Blackwood's reach was longer and his resources greater than either he or Kiona had imagined. "Kane," one of them called out, his voice carrying the authority of command. "We know you're in there, and we know what you're carrying." The man was tall and lean, with the bearing of a cavalry officer and a voice that spoke of education and breeding. "My name is Major Samuel Cross, and I'm here on behalf of General Blackwood to offer you terms." The use of his name confirmed what Matthias had already suspected. This wasn't a chance encounter but a carefully planned operation. And somehow Blackwood had learned not just about the evidence, but about Matthias's involvement in its recovery. The implications were staggering, because it meant the general had sources of information that extended far beyond his official position, a network of spies and informants that could reach into the remotest corners of the territory. "What kind of terms?" Matthias called back, though he had no intention of surrendering. He wanted to keep them talking while he studied their positions and looked for weaknesses. Through the window he could see at least 6 men positioned around the clearing, probably more hidden in the trees, and all of them carried rifles with the confidence of men who knew how to use them. "Surrender the documents and walk away," Cross replied, his tone suggesting he thought the offer was generous. The general has no quarrel with you personally, Kane. Your service record shows you were a good soldier who followed orders, and good soldiers deserve better than to die for. The schemes of savage insurgents. The casual racism in his voice made Matthias's jaw clench. And he was reminded once again of why he had left the army and everything it represented. And if I refuse, Matthias asked, though he already knew the answer. These men hadn't come to negotiate, but to eliminate a threat, and any offer of mercy was just another tactic in their assault. He checked his weapons one more time, counting bullets and trying to estimate how long he could hold them off. The cabin was defensible, but not impregnable, and eventually they would find a way in. Then you die here, Cross said with the matter-of-fact tone of a man discussing the weather. And we take the papers from your corpse. The end result is the same, Kane. But this way you get to walk away and start over somewhere else. The offer was meaningless, of course, because men like Cross didn't leave witnesses alive to testify about their activities. But Matthias appreciated the courtesy of the lie. I have a counter-offer, Matthias called out, and his voice carried across the clearing with the authority of a man who had finally found his purpose. You and your men turn around and ride back to Salem, and I don't kill every last one of you where you stand. The threat was largely empty, given that he was outnumbered and outgunned, but he wanted them to understand that he wasn't the broken down drunk they might have expected to find. Cross's laugh held genuine amusement, the sound of a professional soldier who had heard empty threats from desperate men before. I admire your spirit, Kane, but let's be practical about this. You're one man with a pistol against 6 trained soldiers with rifles. The mathematics are not in your favor. There was movement in the trees, his men repositioning for an assault, and Matthias realized that the talking phase was over. The attack came from 3 directions at once, a coordinated assault that spoke of military training and careful planning. Bullets shattered the cabin's windows and punched through the log walls, filling the air with splinters and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Matthias returned fire from the largest window, trying to make each shot count while bullets whistled around his head like angry hornets. The noise was deafening in the confined space, and smoke from the gunfire began to obscure his vision. He managed to drop one of the attackers with a lucky shot, the man falling with a scream that was audible even over the gunfire. But the others pressed their attack with the relentless efficiency of professionals, advancing by bounds while maintaining covering fire. Matthias realized that his position was untenable, that staying in the cabin meant death, and that his only chance was to break out and try to lose them in the forest. As bullets continued to tear through the cabin walls, Matthias made his final preparations, checking that the precious documents were secure against his body and saying a silent prayer for Kiona's safety. Wherever she was hiding in the vast wilderness of the Cascade Mountains, he had kept his promise to draw their pursuers away from her, and now all that remained was to lead them as far as possible before making his last stand. The sound of splintering would announce that they were breaking down the door, and Matthias Kane prepared to sell his life as dearly as possible. The war cry that split the morning air came from the ridge above the cabin, like the voice of ancient spirits returning to reclaim their stolen land. And as Matthias watched in stunned amazement, a line of Yakama warriors appeared among the trees with bows drawn and faces painted for battle, their arrows finding targets with deadly precision, as Major Cross's men suddenly found themselves caught between the cabin they were attacking and an enemy they hadn't seen coming. The professional soldiers who had seemed so confident moments before now scrambled for cover as the forest itself seemed to come alive with the whisper of bowstrings and the thud of arrows finding flesh. At the head of the war party rode a man Matthias recognized despite the 15 years that had passed since their last meeting. Joseph Crow Feather moved with the same fluid grace he had possessed as a young warrior, though gray now streaked his long black hair and new scars marked his weathered face. He carried a Winchester rifle with the easy familiarity of someone who had learned to blend traditional weapons with modern necessities, and when his eyes found Matthias through the shattered window of the cabin, there was recognition there. And something that might have been grim satisfaction. "Cain," Crowfeather called out in English, his voice carrying the authority of a war chief addressing an enemy. "Come out and face judgment for your crimes, or hide like a coward while better men settle your debts." The challenge was issued in the formal manner of the old ways, giving Matthias a choice between honor and shame, and despite everything that had happened, despite the blood between them, he felt compelled to answer. Matthias stepped through the bullet-riddled door of the cabin, with his hands visible but not raised, the Colt .45 still holstered at his side, and as he faced the man whose sister he had helped make a widow, whose people he had helped scatter to the winds, he felt the weight of 15 years settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Around the clearing, Cross's surviving soldiers had taken cover behind trees and rocks, but they were clearly outmatched and outnumbered by warriors who knew this country like the lines on their own hands. "Joseph Crowfeather," Matthias said, inclining his head with the respect due to a war chief. Though he knew that respect might not save his life, "I remember you from the old days, before the world went mad and good men chose sides that made them enemies." The warrior studied him with dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul, weighing his words against his actions, measuring the man he had become against the soldier he had been. "You remember me," Crowfeather said, his voice carrying no warmth but no immediate threat either. "But do you remember my sister Running Bear, who became a widow because of your rifle? Or my nephew Little Wolf, who grew up without a father? Because you followed the orders of a murderer." The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and Matthias felt each word like a physical blow, but forced himself to meet the war chief's gaze without flinching. "I remember them all," Matthias said quietly. "Every face, every name, every life that was lost, because I was too young and too stupid to question orders that should never have been given." He gestured toward the soldiers still hiding in the trees. "But these men work for the same monster who gave those orders, the same General Blackwood who turned your father's peace mission into a massacre. And right now they're trying to stop the truth from reaching people who might finally bring him to justice." Something shifted in Crowfeather's expression, a flicker of interest that suggested Matthias had said something unexpected. And when the war chief spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, less anger and more calculation. "What truth?" he asked. "What justice could possibly matter to a man like you, who spent 15 years hiding in the wilderness while my people suffered for crimes they never committed?" "Your niece has evidence," Matthias said, and he saw Crowfeather's eyes widen with surprise and something that might have been hope. "Tiona Redwing carries papers that prove the massacre was planned from the beginning, that your father died not in battle, but in a deliberate murder designed to provoke a war." He pulled the documents from his shirt, holding them where the war chief could see them, letters in Blackwood's own hand, military orders, everything needed to expose him as the war criminal he is. The revelation hit Crowfeather like a physical blow, and for a moment the mask of stoic dignity slipped, revealing the pain of a man who had spent 15 years believing his father had died for nothing. "Kiona lives," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "I thought she had perished with the rest of the fishing camp when the soldiers came." The hope in his eyes was almost too bright to look at, the desperate hope of a man who had thought his family line was broken forever. "She's alive," Matthias confirmed, "wounded but alive, hiding in the old mining camp north of Mill Creek Canyon. But these soldiers are hunting her, hunting both of us, because Blackwood knows about the evidence and will do anything to suppress." "Eat," he gestured toward Major Cross, who was still pinned down behind a fallen log with what remained of his men. "They've been tracking us since we left Fort Cascade, and they won't stop until we're all dead, and the truth dies with us." Crowfeather looked from Matthias to the hidden soldiers and back again, his warrior's mind weighing tactics and loyalties, alliances and betrayals. And when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a decision that would reshape the balance of power in the Oregon Territory. "You will take me to my niece," he said. And together we will see this evidence delivered to those who can act upon it. But first we must deal with these dogs who dare to hunt the daughter of Thomas Redwin on the sacred lands of our ancestors. What followed was not a battle, but an execution, as Crowfeather's warriors moved through the forest with the silent efficiency of natural predators, eliminating Cross's men one by one, with a combination of traditional weapons and captured army rifles. The Major himself tried to negotiate, offering gold and promises of safe passage if they would only hand over the documents. But his words fell on ears that had heard too many broken promises from white officials, and his death came swift and clean, an arrow through the heart that dropped him without a sound. "It is finished," Crowfeather said as his warriors emerged from the trees, checking bodies and gathering weapons with the methodical thoroughness of men who had learned to waste nothing. "These men will trouble no one again, and their horses and supplies are now ours." He looked at Matthias with something that might have been the beginning of respect. "You fought well for a man carrying the weight of old sins. And you protected my niece when you could have saved yourself." The journey to the mining camp took 2 hours, following game trails that only the Yakama knew existed. And as they rode through the autumn forest, Crowfeather told Matthias stories of the 15 years since the massacre, of how the survivors had scattered but not broken, how they had maintained their traditions in hidden camps and secret gatherings, how they had waited for the day when justice might finally be possible. The war chief's words painted a picture of a people who had endured unspeakable hardships but had never surrendered their dignity or their hope for a better future. "We have tried the white man's courts before," Crowfeather said as they crested a ridge that offered a view of the distant mining camp, sent delegations to Salem and Portland, hired lawyers with money we could not afford, only to see our petitions dismissed and our advocates threatened into silence. His voice carried the bitterness of a man who had learned that justice was a luxury that his people were not allowed to purchase. But perhaps evidence written in the hand of their own general will carry more weight than the testimony of ignorant savages. They found Kiona exactly where she had promised to wait, in the ruins of the old mining camp where prospectors had once torn apart the mountainside in search of gold that had never materialized. She had bound her wounded leg with strips torn from her dress and built a small fire in the shelter of a collapsed building. And when she saw her uncle riding toward her with Matthias beside him, her face showed an emotion Matthias had never seen there before. Pure joy, uncomplicated by pain or anger or the weight of terrible memories. The reunion between uncle and niece was conducted in the Yakama language, a flowing conversation full of gestures and expressions that spoke of bonds deeper than blood. And though Matthias couldn't understand the words, he could feel the healing power of family connection, the way that finding each other again seemed to mend something in both of them that had been broken for 15 years. When they finally turned back to him, both carried themselves differently, as if the mere fact of being together had restored some essential part of their identity. "My uncle tells me you saved his life," Kiona said, her voice carrying a warmth it had never held when speaking to him before. "That you could have run when the soldiers came, but chose to fight beside warriors who had no reason to trust." She studied his face with eyes that seemed to see him differently now, not just as the enemy who had destroyed her family, but as a man capable of choosing redemption over self-preservation. "I did what needed to be done," Matthias said, uncomfortable with praise from people he had wronged so deeply. "The debt I owe your family can never be repaid, but maybe it can be acknowledged. Maybe I can spend what's left of my life working to balance scales that will never truly be even." He looked at the evidence still clutched in her hands, at the papers that represented 15 years of planning and hope. "The question now is how we get this to Salem without Blackwood's people intercepting us again." Crowfeather smiled, and there was something almost predatory in his expression, the look of a man who had finally seen an opportunity to strike back at enemies who had thought themselves untouchable. "General Blackwood thinks like a white soldier," he said. "He expects his enemies to use white roads and white methods. to announce themselves with bugles and banners like civilized men. The war chief gestured toward the vast wilderness that stretched in all directions around them. But this is our country, and we know paths through the mountains that no map has ever recorded. The plan that emerged from their discussion was audacious in its simplicity and brilliant in its understanding of both terrain and psychology. Instead of taking the obvious route south to Salem, they would travel east through the Cascade Peaks, following ancient trading paths that connected the Columbia River with the inland territories, paths that would be impassable to large groups of mounted soldiers but perfectly suited to a small party traveling light and fast. The journey would be dangerous, with early winter storms already building in the high country, but it would also be unexpected, giving them the element of surprise that might be their only advantage. "There is risk," Crowfeather admitted as they studied the rough map he had drawn in the dirt. "The high passes are treacherous, even in good weather, and if we are caught by a blizzard above the tree line, we will not survive." He looked at his niece's wounded leg, at Matthias's exhausted face. "But the alternative is certain death at the hands of Blackwood's hunters. And at least in the mountains we die as free people, rather than as hunted animals." Kiona nodded without hesitation, her decision made long ago during the dark years when staying alive had required constant risk and perpetual vigilance. "I have carried this burden for 15 years, she said, touching the papers that contained the evidence of her father's murder. "I will carry it 15 more if necessary, but I will not let it die with me in some nameless valley, while the man who killed my father grows fat on his stolen honors." As they prepared to leave the mining camp behind and begin their perilous journey into the high country, Matthias found himself looking at his unlikely companions with something approaching amazement. A day ago he had been a broken-down lumberjack, carrying nothing but guilt and self-recrimination. And now he was part of a war party carrying evidence that could bring down one of the most powerful men in the Oregon Territory. The irony wasn't lost on him that his redemption might come through alliance with the very people he had helped to wrong, but perhaps that was fitting. Perhaps justice required that kind of circular completion. "Before we go," Crowfeather said, his voice taking on the formal tone used for important ceremonies, "there's something that must be said." He looked directly at Matthias, his dark eyes holding no hatred now, only a kind of grim recognition. "You were our enemy, and you helped to destroy our world. But today you chose to stand with us against those who would silence the truth." The war chief extended his hand in the white man's gesture of respect. "I cannot forgive what was done, but I can acknowledge what you have become." Matthias took the offered hand, feeling the strength in the war chief's grip and the weight of acceptance he had never dared hope for. "I don't ask for forgiveness," he said quietly. "I ask only for the chance to help make this right, to see your father's murder exposed and his killer brought to justice." The handshake lasted only a moment, but in that brief contact, Matthias felt something shift inside him, some fundamental change that transformed him from a man haunted by his past into a man determined to reshape his future. As they mounted their horses and prepared to disappear into the vast wilderness of the Cascade Mountains, Matthias looked back once at the mining camp, where he had found something he hadn't known he was looking for. Not forgiveness, which was perhaps impossible, but acceptance, which was perhaps enough. The road ahead would be treacherous and uncertain, but for the first time in 15 years, he was riding towards something instead of running away from it, and that made all the difference in the world. The blizzard struck without warning as they crested Eagle's Nest Pass, transforming the world into a howling white nightmare, where visibility dropped to mere feet and the wind cut through their clothes like knives forged from Arctic ice. Matthias felt his horse stumble beneath him as the trail disappeared under a blanket of snow that seemed to deepen with every passing minute. And through the swirling chaos, he could barely make out the dark shapes of his companions as they fought to stay together in conditions that could separate and kill them within moments. The altitude made every breath a struggle, and he could feel the cold seeping into his bones despite the heavy coat crow. Feather's warriors had given him from their captured supplies. "We have to find shelter," Kiona shouted over the wind, her voice barely audible even though she was only a few feet away, her wounded leg clearly causing her agony in the brutal cold, but her eyes still held the fierce determination that had carried her through 15 years of survival. "There's a cave system near the old hunting lodge. If we can reach it before we freeze." She pointed into the white void ahead of them, though Matthias could see nothing but swirling snow and the occasional dark bulk of a pine tree bent nearly horizontal by the gale. Crowfeather moved to the front of their small party, his intimate knowledge of these mountains, their only hope of navigation in the whiteout conditions, and Matthias marveled at how the war chief seemed to find direction where there was none. Following landmarks invisible to white eyes, reading the land like a book written in a language known only to his people. The horses were struggling now, their hooves slipping on ice-covered rocks sitting beneath the snow, and more than once Matthias felt his mount nearly go down as they picked their way along what he hoped was still a trail. The hunting lodge. When it finally materialized out of the storm like a ghost ship emerging from fog, was nothing more than a collapsed ruin, its roof caved in and its walls scattered by years of weather and neglect. But beyond it, barely visible in the driving snow, was the dark mouth of a cave that promised shelter from the killing wind. They dismounted and led their horses into the cavern, grateful to escape the brutal assault of the blizzard even as they realized their situation was still desperate inside the cave, as Crowfeather's warriors worked to build a fire from deadwood they had carried with them. Matthias took stock of their supplies and felt his heart sink at what he found. They had food for perhaps 3 days if they rationed carefully, and the storm outside showed no signs of abating, while the temperature continued to drop toward levels that would kill exposed humans within hours. Worse still, Kiona's leg wound had reopened during the climb, and she was losing blood at a rate that would weaken her dangerously if not stopped soon. "How long do these storms usually last?" Matthias asked Crowfeather as they huddled around the small fire, trying to warm themselves while conserving fuel. The war chief's expression was grim as he studied the cave entrance where snow was already beginning to pile up despite the overhang that protected them from the worst of the wind. "In the old days, my grandfather spoke of storms that lasted 7 days in these peaks," Crowfeather replied, his voice carrying the weight of ancestral memory. "Storms that turned whole war parties into ice statues, preserved until the spring. Thaw revealed their bones." He looked at their meager supplies, at his niece's pale face, at the horses that stood shivering despite being out of the wind. "But we cannot wait for this wind to pass. We must find another way." That was when Kiona spoke up from where she sat, binding her wounded leg with strips of cloth, her voice weak but determined. "There is another path," she said. "A tunnel that runs through the heart of the mountain, part of the old lava tubes that were carved when the earth was young." She looked at her uncle with eyes that held both hope and desperation. "Father told me stories about it, how our people used it in the ancient times to travel between the summer and winter hunting grounds." Crowfeather's eyes widened with recognition and something that might have been awe. "The Spirit Road," he whispered. "I thought it was only a legend, a story told to children to teach them about the power of the earth." But Kiona shook her head, pulling something from inside her dress that made Matthias gasp with surprise. A piece of carved bone covered with symbols he didn't recognize, but that clearly meant something profound to the two Yakama. "Father gave this to me before he rode to the peace meeting," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she traced the ancient markings with her finger. "Told me it was a map of the old ways, the secret paths that only our family was allowed to know." The bone carving was obviously very old, worn smooth by countless hands, and the symbols carved into its surface seemed to dance in the firelight like living things. "If the Spirit Road still exists," Crowfeather said slowly, studying the bone map with the reverence due to a sacred relic, "it would take us completely around the storm, bring us out near the Willamette Valley where the weather is mild and Blackwood's influence is weakest." He looked at Matthias with eyes that held a mixture of hope and uncertainty. But the old stories also speak of dangers in the deep places, of spirits that guard the ancient ways and do not welcome strangers. The decision, when it came, was really no decision at all, because staying in the cave meant slow death from cold and starvation. While the tunnel offered at least the possibility of survival, even if it came with risks they couldn't fully understand. Matthias helped Kiona to her feet, noting how she favored her wounded leg and trying not to think about what would happen. If she couldn't walk when they needed to move fast, the tunnel entrance was hidden behind a fall of rocks at the back of the cave, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Moving the stones that blocked the entrance took all of them working together, and when they finally cleared enough space to squeeze through, the darkness beyond seemed to swallow their torchlight like a hungry beast. The tunnel was larger than Matthias had expected, carved by ancient volcanic forces into a smooth-walled passage that stretched into blackness beyond the reach of their flames. The air inside was warmer than the cave, though it carried strange scents that spoke of deep places and old secrets. They led their horses into the tunnel single file, Crowfeather in the lead with a torch held high, following the bone map's cryptic directions as they descended into the heart of the mountain. The passage branched and twisted in ways that seemed to defy logic, sometimes opening into vast chambers where their voices echoed like thunder, sometimes narrowing to corridors barely wide enough for the horses to pass, and always there was the sense of being watched, of ancient eyes following their progress through the deep places of the earth. Hours passed in the eternal twilight of the tunnel, marked only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on stone and the flickering dance of torchlight on carved walls that showed signs of human habitation from ages past. Matthias saw pictographs that told stories he couldn't read, symbols that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. And sometimes he could swear he heard voices whispering in languages that predated any he knew, speaking words that seemed to come from the stone itself. It was Kiona who first noticed that they were being followed, her voice cutting through the hypnotic rhythm of their passage with an urgency that brought them all to a halt. "Behind us," she whispered. "Something is moving in the darkness, keeping pace but staying just beyond our light." Matthias strained his ears but could hear nothing except the drip of water and the soft breathing of their horses. Yet he felt it too, a presence in the blackness that watched and waited with patient malevolence. "The Guardians," Crowfeather said quietly, his voice carrying a respect born of ancestral fear. "The old stories speak of them, spirits bound to protect the sacred ways from those who would misuse them." He studied the bone map in the torchlight, tracing symbols with his finger. "But my niece carries the mark of the blood rite, and we travel on a mission of justice. Perhaps they will allow us to pass." The test came without warning as they entered a vast circular chamber, where the tunnel opened into a natural cathedral carved from living rock. And suddenly the darkness around them came alive with shapes that might have been human once, but were something else now, something that belonged to the deep places and the old ways. They moved without sound, these guardians of the spirit road, surrounding the small party with the fluid grace of smoke made manifest. Kiona stepped forward, holding the bone map high so that all could see it. And when she spoke, her voice carried the formal cadence of ritual language, words in the old tongue that seemed to resonate with the stone itself. "I am Kiona Redwing, daughter of Thomas Redwing, keeper of the blood rite and bearer of the sacred trust," she said. "I seek passage for myself and my companions on a mission of justice, to bring truth to light and honor to the dead." The response came not in words, but in images that flooded their minds. Visions of the massacre 15 years ago, of Thomas Redwing falling with Blackwood's bullet in his heart, of villages burning and children crying as their world was destroyed by men who called themselves civilized. And through it all, Matthias felt the weight of judgment, the terrible scrutiny of beings who could see into his soul and measure the truth of his repentance against the magnitude of his crimes. When the visions faded, the guardians began to withdraw. melting back into the darkness from which they had come. But not before one of them approached Matthias directly, its form shifting between human and shadow, and placed something cold and hard into his palm. When he looked down, he saw a small stone carved with symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "A token," Crowfeather said with wonder in his voice. "They have given you a token of safe passage, marked you as one who may walk the old ways without fear." The war chief looked at Matthias with new respect. "The guardians see truth where mortals see only surface. They have judged your heart and found it worthy of redemption." The rest of their journey through the Spirit Road passed without incident, and when they finally emerged from the tunnel into blessed daylight, they found themselves in a valley where autumn still held sway, and the storm that had nearly killed them was nothing more than a line of dark clouds on the distant peaks. The horses seemed to sense their relief, stepping more lively as they descended toward the Willamette Valley and the final stage of their mission. Below them, scattered across the fertile valley floor like toys dropped by a giant child, were the farms and towns that represented civilization in the Oregon Territory. And somewhere among them was Salem, where General Harrison Blackwood waited in his comfortable mansion, believing himself safe from the consequences of his crimes. But justice was coming down from the mountains now, carried by the daughter of his victim and witnessed by the man whose conscience had finally awakened after 15 years of sleep. The territorial courthouse in Salem stood like a monument to civilization in the heart of the Willamette Valley, its white columns gleaming in the morning sunlight as crowds gathered to witness what the newspapers were already calling the trial of the century. And as Matthias Kane walked up those marble steps with Kiona Redwing beside him and Joseph Crowfeather behind them, he felt the weight of 15 years lifting from his shoulders with each footfall. The evidence they carried had already shaken the foundations of the territorial government, and today would see either justice finally served or the complete corruption of everything the law was supposed to represent. Attorney General Marcus Wellington, a thin man with silver hair and eyes like winter steel, had staked his entire career on this prosecution after examining the documents Kiona had preserved for 15 years. And when he met them at the courthouse entrance, his face showed the grim satisfaction of a man who finally had the tools to bring down a monster. The grand jury took less than an hour to indict Blackwood on charges of murder, conspiracy, and crimes against humanity, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades fighting for justice in a system designed to protect the powerful. But he's hired the best lawyers money can buy, and they'll try every trick in the book to discredit your testimony. Inside the courthouse, the gallery was packed with reporters, politicians, and ordinary citizens who had come to see whether the territorial elite could finally be held accountable for their crimes. But Matthias noticed that the front rows were filled with men whose expensive clothes and cold eyes marked them as Blackwood's allies, powerful figures who had profited from the general's campaigns against the native tribes and who would do anything to protect their own interests. The tension in the air was so thick it could be cut with a knife, and Matthias realized this trial would be about more than one man's guilt or innocence. General Harrison Blackwood entered the courtroom like a man attending his own coronation, rather than his own trial, his silver hair perfectly groomed, and his dress uniform decorated with medals earned through the systematic murder of innocent people. At 63 he still carried himself with military bearing, and when his eyes swept the gallery and found Matthias sitting with Kiona and Crowfeather, his smile held no warmth, only the cold satisfaction of a predator who believed his prey had finally walked into his trap. He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging an old acquaintance at a social gathering. And Matthias felt his blood run cold at the casual arrogance of the gesture. Judge Harrison Carmichael, a man whose reputation for integrity was legendary throughout the territory, called the court to order with a gravity that befitted the historic nature of the proceedings. And as the charges were read aloud, each count of murder and conspiracy hung in the air like an indictment of the entire system that had allowed such crimes to flourish for so long. Blackwood's defense attorney, the famous Philadelphia lawyer Jonathan Harrington, objected to nearly every word, but the judge's steel gaze made it clear that legal theatrics would find no purchase in his courtroom. The prosecution's case began. With the reading of Blackwood's own letters, the damning documents that Kiona had risked everything to preserve. And as Wellington's clear voice filled the courtroom with words written in the general's own hand, describing his plans to provoke war with the Yakama people and eliminate their leadership through aggressive military action, a murmur of shock and disgust rippled through the gallery. Even Blackwood's supporters seemed shaken by the casual way their hero had planned genocide. The bureaucratic language that transformed mass murder into military strategy. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Wellington said as he held up the evidence that had survived 15 years in hiding, "these are not the words of a soldier defending civilization. These are the words of a war criminal planning the extermination of an entire people for the sake of political advancement." He looked directly at Blackwood, who sat unmoved by the accusations. "And the prosecution will prove that General Blackwood not only planned these crimes, but carried them out with ruthless efficiency, turning a peace mission into a massacre and then covering up his actions through intimidation and murder." When Kiona took the witness stand, the courtroom fell completely silent, and Matthias felt his heart swell with pride as she faced down the man who had destroyed her family with the same courage her father had shown 15 years ago. Her testimony was devastating in its simplicity, describing the morning of the massacre from the perspective of a 12-year-old girl who had watched her world burn, and when she produced the bone map that had guided them through the spirit road, identifying it as a sacred relic passed down through generations of her family. Even the hardest hearts in the gallery seemed moved by the weight of history she carried. "My father went to the peace meeting believing in the honor of white soldiers," she said, her voice clear and strong despite the pain of remembering. "He carried gifts and promises, offered to move our people to the reservation lands without bloodshed, trusted in the word of men who called themselves civilized." She looked directly at Blackwood, her dark eyes blazing with 15 years of accumulated grief and rage. "But civilized men don't murder peace envoys, and they don't burn villages full of children to advance their careers." Harrington's cross-examination was brutal, attacking Kiona's credibility and suggesting that her testimony was motivated by revenge rather than justice. But she answered every question with dignity and precision, never allowing the defense attorney to rattle her composure or shake her story. When he suggested that the bone map was a forgery created to support her claims, she spoke a phrase in the old Yakama language, and the symbols on the ancient carving began to glow with the same inner light Matthias had seen in the Spirit Road. A phenomenon that left the courtroom gasping in amazement and the defense team scrambling for explanations. Joseph Crowfeather's testimony provided historical context that transformed individual crimes into systematic genocide, describing how Blackwood's campaigns had scattered the Yakama people and destroyed their traditional way of life. And when he spoke of the children who had grown up as orphans and the elders who had died in exile, his words carried the weight of a people's suffering. The war chief's dignity and obvious intelligence demolished any suggestion that the Yakama were savage or uncivilized, and his detailed knowledge of military tactics made it clear that Blackwood's victory had come through treachery rather than superior strategy. But it was Matthias's testimony that truly sealed Blackwood's fate, because here was one of the general's own soldiers, a man who had been present at the massacre and could describe in precise detail how the peace mission had been transformed into a killing field. His voice shook as he recounted receiving the order to fire on unarmed civilians, the way Blackwood had smiled when Chief Redwing fell, the casual orders to burn the village and eliminate any witnesses. Every word was a nail in the general's coffin. And when Harrington tried to discredit him as a deserter and drunk, Matthias simply rolled up his sleeves and showed the scars he had earned in 15 years of honest labor. "I was a coward once," Matthias said, looking directly at the jury. A young soldier who followed orders without questioning where they came from or who they hurt. But 15 years of living with the consequences of that cowardice taught me the difference between duty and murder. He gestured toward Blackwood, who sat stone-faced as his crimes were laid bare. This man turned me into a killer by telling me I was serving my country. But serving your country doesn't mean murdering children, and following orders doesn't excuse genocide. The defense's case was a masterwork of misdirection and character assassination, with Harrington calling a parade of military witnesses who testified to Blackwood's heroic service and his vital role in protecting settlers from Indian depredations. But their testimony rang hollow against the weight of documentary evidence and eyewitness accounts. The general himself took the stand in his own defense, maintaining his innocence with the smooth confidence of a career politician. But when Wellington confronted him with his own letters and forced him to read his plans for aggressive military action aloud, the mask of respectability finally slipped. "Those letters are taken out of context," Blackwood said, his voice losing its military precision as desperation crept in. The Yakama were planning attacks on innocent settlers. We had intelligence reports, communications intercepted by our scouts. But when Wellington demanded to see this evidence, the general's lawyers could produce nothing, and it became clear that the intelligence reports were as fictional as the general's claims of self-defense. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, and when they returned with their verdict, the foreman's voice was steady and clear as he pronounced the word that 15 years of injustice had made necessary. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in chaos, with Blackwood's supporters shouting protests while others cheered. The long-delayed arrival of justice, but through it all, Matthias sat quietly beside Kiona and felt something he hadn't experienced since before the massacre. Peace. Judge Carmichael's sentencing was swift and final, his words carrying the weight of moral authority as he condemned Blackwood to death by hanging, to be carried out within 30 days. "The crimes you have committed," the judge said, looking down at the general who had finally been stripped of his pretenses, "represent not just murder, but a betrayal of everything our legal system is supposed to protect." He gestured toward Kiona and Crowfeather. "You have stolen children's futures and murdered their dreams, and no amount of military service can excuse or mitigate such evil." The execution took place on a gray November morning, with crowds gathered in the prison yard to witness the final chapter of a story that had begun with gunfire and ended with justice. Matthias stood with Kiona and Crowfeather as the trapdoor opened, and Harrison Blackwood paid the ultimate price for his crimes. And though he felt no joy in the general's death, he felt the profound satisfaction of seeing the scales finally balanced. In the months that followed, the territorial government underwent massive reforms, with corrupt officials removed and new protections established for native rights. The Yakama people were granted compensation for their losses and recognition of their sovereignty over traditional lands, and Kiona became an advocate for her people, using her intelligence and education to navigate the white man's legal system while never forgetting her cultural heritage. She married a young teacher who respected her strength and shared her vision of justice, and they raised children who knew both worlds but belonged fully to neither. Matthias returned to the lumber camps, but not as the broken man who had fled into the wilderness 15 years earlier. He became a foreman and eventually owned his own operation, treating his workers fairly and using his profits to fund schools and hospitals for both white and native communities. He never married, but he was not alone, because Kiona and Crowfeather had become the family he had never dared hope for, and their friendship healed wounds he had thought would never stop bleeding. On the 50th anniversary of Thomas Redwing's death, they gathered at his grave in the Yakama cemetery, where his body had finally been laid to rest with full honors. And as they stood together in the autumn sunlight, Matthias felt the presence of the man he had killed, and somehow knew that forgiveness was possible, even for the gravest sins, when it was accompanied by genuine repentance and the courage to make things right. The stone the guardians had given him in the spirit road still rested in his pocket, warm against his palm. A reminder that redemption was not just possible but necessary, and that sometimes the greatest justice came not from punishment, but from transformation. As the sun set over the Cascade Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Matthias Kane stood with the family he had found and the peace he had earned, understanding finally that some stories don't end with vengeance but with healing, and that the best justice is the kind that makes broken things whole again.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.